This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. So I've got a bunch of interesting clips today, audio clips. I'm not going to throw a monologue at you today. I'm not going to throw an interview at you today, but I am going to throw some clips that I have found. A couple of them I probably played before, but most of these are ones that I've not put in a podcast before. Let me open with Big Daddy Buffett. I thought this was a good short clip. He was talking about long-term capital management, the hedge fund that almost took the system down back in the summer of 1998. A huge, huge winning time period for trend followers. You might say to yourself, Covel, what does the summer of 1998 have to do with anything? Well, if you don't want it to do with anything, you don't have to have it do with anything. That's your choice. That was almost like Yoda speaking there. If you don't want to have to do it with anything, yeah, it kind of sounds like a Yoda that might have been drinking or something. Anyways, without further ado, Mr. Big Daddy Warren Buffett.
The whole long-term capital management, and I hope most of you are familiar with it, but the whole story is really fascinating because if you take John Meriwether and Eric Rosenfeld, Larry Hillenbrand, Greg Hawkins, Victor Agani, the two Nobel Prize winners, Merton and Scholes, if you take the 16 of them, they probably have as high an average IQ as any 16 people working together in one business in the country, including at Microsoft or wherever you want to name. So an incredible amount of intellect in that room. Now you combine that with the fact that those 16 had extensive experience in the field they were operating. I mean, this was not a bunch of guys who had made their money, selling men's clothing and then all of a sudden went into the securities business or anything. They'd had in aggregate, the 16 had probably had 350 or 400 years of experience doing exactly what they were doing. And then you throw in the third factor, that most of them had virtually all of their very substantial net worths in the business. So they had their own money up, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of their own money up, super high intellect, working in a field they knew, and essentially they went broke. And that to me is absolutely fascinating. I mean, if I ever write a book, it's going to be called Why Smart People Do Dumb Things. My partner says it should be autobiographical, but this might be an interesting illustration. And these are perfectly decent guys. I respect them, and they helped me out when I had problems with Solomon, and so they're not bad people at all. But to make money they didn't have and didn't need, they risked what they did have and did need. And that's foolish. That is just plain foolish. It doesn't make any difference what your IQ is. If you risk something that is important to you for something that is unimportant to you, it just does not make any sense. I don't care whether the odds are 100 to 1 that you succeed or 1,000 to 1 that you succeed. If you hand me a gun with 1,000 chambers, 1,000,000 chambers in it, and there's a bullet in one chamber, and you said, put it up your temple, how much do you want to be paid to pull it once? I'm not going to pull it. You can name any sum you want, but it doesn't do anything for me on the upside. And I think the downside's fairly clear. So I'm not interested in that kind of a game. And yet people do it financially and without thinking about it very much. There was a great book. It wasn't a great book. It was a great title. There was a lousy book written once with a great title by Walter Gutman. The title was You Only Have to Get Rich Once. Now, that seems pretty fundamental, doesn't it?
The next clip I'm going to play, actually the next two clips I'm going to play are from David Harding, the founder of Winton Capital, one of the top trend following traders. Here is the first clip, and he is talking about the lack of data on history's great manias, crashes, and panics.
The conference very interesting. I do find it very interesting. My modest interest is to collect more data, to have more data, more data for longer periods of history. I have personal and professional reasons for wanting to see that data, but I'm also just have academic curiosity. I really want to see 1825 proper illustration of the bubbles of 1825, and I can't find one anywhere in any books, in any texts, and so on and so forth. A picture's worth 1,000 words, and that to me is worth, is worth money and effort. And I would just like to see that done on a larger scale. I feel that this is an underexploited theme in history. It's a lateral theme in history. The behaviour of people with respect to money, and how markets and mania. Well, I'm just wanting to update Charles Mackay. Charles Mackay wrote a book about manias, panics, and crashes, starting in market terms with the tulip mania and the South Sea bubble and these relatively well-known but still under-researched periods, but he included in that wider phenomenon like the Crusades, and one might include other wider phenomenon, like National Socialism in the 20th century. In other words, people have a tendency to herd and to believe things that aren't true and to follow one another and copy one another and follow fashion. And, you're starting to move into big subjects, and the issue of financial markets, they just happen to be a very convenient laboratory for studying human behaviour. And my limited expertise is in markets and data and numbers.
Now, the second clip, he talks about the difference between today's financial bubbles and crashes and other ones over the centuries. I bet you're willing to go where you think this is going to go, which is there's no difference. They're all the same.
This has all happened before. It's happened numerous times before. The amazing thing, if you read, for example, 19th century English literature, for example, I just finished reading The Way We Live Now, and you read about Melmoth, the collapse of the great financier, or you read about the end of Overend and Gurney, or the 1825 crisis, the railway crisis in 1845. These sorts of events have been played out before. The extraordinary thing is that the similarities between the event that is now taking place on a global level and the events that took place in a much smaller world 200 years ago. So, given that we have a relatively small number of data points to go on. I mean, Ben Bernanke, in managing this crisis, is focusing entirely on 1929, as though that's the only collapse there's ever been. And people talk about 1929. Well, it's dangerous to rely too much on one data point when you're dealing with something so important. There have been many other examples of financial crises in history, and this crisis resembles some of them more than it resembles 1929.
This next two clips from an author, Peter Bernstein, who is no longer with us. He wrote a great book called Against the Gods about risk. It is still a must-read book. And so I found these two short clips from a Consuelo Mack interview series. And so I think these were worth adding to this whole group of interesting voices that are making up this podcast.
Pascal was a French mathematician in the 17th century, a compulsive gambler, and he was at the gambling tables one night, and a nobleman came up and asked him something about what are the chances something would happen, as a result of which he invented probability. The idea that we can calculate probabilities began with Pascal, 1654. Very religious man, a nut. The other half of his life, he was he led a life of sin, and then he would fluctuate back and forth. Finally retired to a monastery. And he asked himself a question. He said, God is or God is not? Is there a God or is there not a God? And this, he said, you can't reason this because there's no way you can figure it that way. So how do I deal with this question? It's an important question.
Very.
And then he said, well, I can deal with it. I can decide how I lead my life. And that has something to do with whether if I believe in God and lead a virtuous life, and then I die, and there is no God, well, I may have given up some goodies, but I had a pretty good life. But if I lead a bad life of sin and lust, and then I die, and there is a God, I'm in big trouble. And kind of the moral of this story is that there are many cases where we make choices and decisions where the consequences matter more than the probabilities. I may be able to run fast enough to cross the street, before I get hit. But if I'm wrong, I'm mush on the roadway. So once I got it and I learned about this, I use it now in all kinds of decision making where it really matters. That very often you have to forget the probabilities because the consequences are so serious.
Talk about it's important in investing that the consequences matter more. Yeah. Some consequences matter more than the probabilities.
Let me talk about it from a positive side. It doesn't necessarily mean that you always make the cautious decision, maybe the other one. Many years ago, I haven't managed money for a long time, but when I was managing it, a woman came to us who'd been very badly injured. She was in an airplane crash and badly injured and had a settlement from the airline. I think it was $100,000, something like that. All she had in the world. And how do you take care of this? She was young, in her 20s. So we decided we would put half that money in bonds, but the other half we were going to shoot the moon because she didn't have very much anyway. If we lost it, she was in trouble anyhow. But if we could make a killing on that, it would make a tremendous difference. So this was a case where if we were wrong, we felt the damage would be minor, and that being right was what could really pay off.
One of your quotes is, "We really do not know what the future holds. Risk in our world is nothing more than uncertainty about the decision that other human beings are going to make and how we can best respond to those decisions." What are some of the decisions that human beings are making now that either that are changing the markets, that represent opportunity or risk?
This is an important idea. You think, oh, the markets are going to give us 11% over the long run or whatever. The markets are going to give us whatever somebody else will pay for what we own. And you really don't know what that's going to be. It's a very, very important distinction.
When you look at, again, how these capital ideas are evolving, what are some of the key evolutions that we should know about that will help us become better investors?
Well, I think it sounds simple and repetitious, but that risk is the centerpiece. That we can't manage returns. We're going to get what we're going to get, but we can manage our risk. And I think that people think in terms of where do I want to be and what should I own and what do I want to buy, and that's where they begin. But they should begin by thinking about how much can I stand the heat in the oven, and really think about that hard. I mean, Harry Markowitz, who kind of was the man who started this whole business in 1952, he was sent to read a book about how to value stocks. He didn't know anything at all. And it said you should buy the single best stock that you could find. It was a very famous book. And he said, but I have to think about risk as well as return. I mean, a very simple idea.
Right.
But from that, this whole body of thought developed. And from that, the people whom I respect and whom I covered in the book begin from there and constantly test themselves. Yale, to cite it again, has a meeting every year in which they think of everything goes wrong, how serious is this going to be for us, what effect will it have on the university, how much will the endowment suffer, will this affect Yale's position in the world. They go through this whole thing by kind of getting a worst case look. And how long would it be before we come back to where we were? And they do this rigorously every year, and then the whole decision for the next year is based on what that shows.
And so that's something that individuals should be doing
too, yes.
every year as well.
If everything goes down the tube, where am I? Mm-hmm. And I mean, for a lot of people, they may be okay because their portfolio, their security portfolio is a relatively small part of their assets. And if they lost it, it would be a shame, but it wouldn't be as bad as losing their job or losing their home. Mm-hmm. So they maybe should be taking more risks than they think they should be because they can afford to do it. Once you've got it made, then it's silly to take more risk. Because
that's interesting.
Lose what you've got.
I see. That's interesting.
Yes.
Because a lot of people, if you assume if you're comfortable and you have the assets that you need to live on, then you can afford to take more risk to get higher returns.
But you don't have to.
You don't have to.
And
right?
risk means that you might lose. Mm-hmm. Whereas if it doesn't matter much anyway, there's a year's income or something in that pot. Shoot the moon.
This next clip is from Vernon Smith. and he was talking to Reason Magazine, Reason TV. I appeared on there once before, and actually Vernon Smith appeared in my documentary film, Broke the New American Dream. I have to tell you, though, I'm a little jealous here. The interviewer for Reason got a much more succinct answer from Dr. Smith. My first question to Dr. Smith got a 36-minute answer that was close to War and Peace in terms of the scope of what he covered. But I think this first 4 minutes of this clip that I'm going to play, I think he goes into some nice territory, and it's definitely worth considering. Dr. Vernon Smith.
Experimental economics destroyed whatever was left in me in the notion that somehow you could do better than to find institutions that organize this decentralized information and create.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're extremely happy to be talking with Vernon Smith, the 2002 Nobel laureate in economic science. Vernon, thanks for talking with us.
Nick, it's great to be here.
You won your Nobel in experimental economics, a pioneering field. Give us the measure. Where is experimental economics today compared to where it was when you were awarded the Nobel?
Well, of course, the award did, I think, attract a lot of attention to experimental economics. But I wouldn't, experimental economics is still not mainstream economics. And it's just, I think, much more important, more influential. In some ways, it's sort of similar to economic history.
We're sitting in your office in Chapman University, a beautiful campus in Orange County, California. Tell us about your setup here, and what kind of experiments are you running, and what are you hoping to find through them?
One of the class of experiments that I'm involved in now is a return to the asset trading experiments that we did in the 80s. And in particular, we're asking some questions that have come out of the economic crisis. Because we started doing asset trading experiments in the 80s and discovered bubbles quite unintentionally.
In your experiments, you were able to create bubbles, or they just popped up?
They popped up. In
Yep.
fact, the baseline that we were running, we thought would be so transparent that we wouldn't observe bubbles. But we thought we would, with that baseline, see if we could create bubbles, but we never had to.
How does a bubble take place? I mean, what goes into
the fundamental value is falling, like this, okay? Say in one of the designs from $3.60 a share to 24 cents a share. The typical pattern for inexperienced subjects is that the trading begins below the fundamental value. The trading prices rise and break through this declining fundamental value, and it'll go up and reach a peak, and it collapses at the end.
They don't recognize that the value is declining, or they don't care?
Let me just say right now that we don't understand why it is that people get caught up in self-reinforcing expectations of rising prices. What they do is, with experience, they come to believe this information we give them is important because they get there by experience. You see, the first time you're in this experiment, you may have bought early and you may sell before the break. No one can tell you you did anything irrational.
Right.
Bring those same people back in another 2 or 3 days, put them in the same environment, and we get a lower volume bubble. Sometimes, typically, it booms earlier and crashes earlier. Well, to some extent, you see they're expecting a bubble. Bring them back a third time, and now they tend to trade fairly close to fundamental value.
How does this type of experiment map onto, I don't know, say maybe the last 5 years in America?
If you think about the housing bubble, buyers, sellers, borrowers, lenders, real estate agents, government regulators, everybody believed that prices would rise and continue to rise. And that is kind of the essence of one of these, of a bubble. Suppose a regulator in 2003 or 4 said, hey, this thing is not sustainable, we've got to do something to stop it. I think he'd have been fired.
Right.
If the bubble had been stopped, say in 2003, before, it'd probably been a lot less damaging. But who's going to know that?
Right.
The author of The Black Swan is next. He doesn't need much introduction. He has a lot of smart things to say.
You can classify objects in three: fragile, robust, anti-fragile. Unlike risk, you can measure fragility. I can measure the fragility of the coffee cup. I cannot figure out, I can have comparative fragility measures. I can't predict an event in complex systems. If you are fragile, you're disproportionately more harmed by a large event than a small event. Let's assume I smash my car against the wall at 50 miles per hour. I'm harmed a lot more than if I smash it 50 times at 1 mile per hour. You agree? Every incremental mile per hour harms me more than the previous one. That's the definition of fragility as acceleration. And when we're going to talk about size, why projects of 100 million pounds are harmed by a lot more by unexpected events than small, that will flow from this graph. This book is organized around 6 books, and it's written in a way for nobody to be able to figure out what the contents of a chapter from the title. Part 1, I talk about biological systems and systems where you have the fragile harmed by being fragile, but the system gains from the fragility of individual components. Like restaurant business is fragile, but the system is good. And I have an anti-Darwinistic stance against something called the naturalistic fallacy, is that nature is not moral. But who you have to rescue is the very weak. To encourage risk-taking on the part of entrepreneurs because the system needs them. You guys got here because of entrepreneurs, not because of bonus earners and bureaucrats, and not thanks to bankers, by the way, all right? So you didn't get here, you didn't start the Industrial Revolution with that. Risk takers who have small downside, big upside. Book 2, I talk about interventionism. And in fact, people, the libertarians hate it, and the anti-libertarians hate it, the status, because in fact, what I say is we tend to micromanage things, as Mr. Gordon Brown has done brilliantly. Book 3, about prediction of system, and I introduce the idea of upside. If a system has anything that has more upside than downside, I ground it in Stoical philosophy because Seneca figured it out. If you have more upside than downside, you're anti-fragile. You're convex. If you have more downside than upside in any action, you're fragile. And Seneca figured it out with his own emotion. He said, I'm very wealthy. I have no upside from money, but if money is taken away from me, I'm harmed. I'm going to change it by forcing myself to become poor every morning. You wake up, you write off all your possessions, so therefore nobody could take anything away from me. I'm robust now. That's sort of the idea of anti-fragility is in the reinterpretation of Seneca. If you read them without reading the commentators, and only a lady, I think, in the UK, Ms. Graver, figured it out, okay, that she read Seneca without reading the commentators, but being Stoic doesn't mean being a vegetable. It means enjoy not having downside from adverse events, but benefiting from positive events. Book 4, I go into something nobody likes, thanks to Terence Keeley. Terence Keeley is someone who studied the Industrial Revolution and figured out something that nobody would say at the time, which is that science doesn't drive technology, but technology comes from science. Jet engine, invented by some theoretician, physicist. No, you look at history, engineers figured it out, all out. Someone came and put it in a book, and engineers don't write books, unfortunately. So I call it lecturing birds how to fly. Birds don't write books on aerodynamics, so we have the illusion, that you lecture a bird how to fly, it flies, you claim credit for it. Now comes to, this is a massively important point linked to something that likes volatility. Your body loves randomness. And there's a way to identify it. Is instead of having a dose of 100 milligrams or something, all right, name whatever you want, today and tomorrow. You had 0 today and 200 tomorrow. Instead of having 100 each day, you benefit from it, then you have this more upside than downside curve. And the same one we used for fragility applies to your body. That your body needs stressors. Effectively, you go to the gym, you need stressors. This is fragility. You look at this as variation of the banking system, mostly with positives and then a big negative. The problem is, during the positive, the bankers made the bonuses, no? During the negative, who paid for them? You pay taxes. An architect should be punished when the house crumbles on the owner, because that removes the incentive of the architect to hide risk in a foundation. And no inspector will know more than the architect. This asymmetry is shocking. At no point in time in history have we had more people with taking the upside at the expense of others. That's a byproduct of complexity. Complexity makes it possible. And when you have large states, people at the top living in Washington dealing with a spreadsheet are never harmed by their mistakes. They're not ashamed. The spreadsheet doesn't make you ashamed. In a small commune, you are ashamed. Never ask a doctor what you should do. Ask him what he would do if you were you. You get a different answer. So this is my ethical point. I never talk about what I want people to do. When I say how to live in a world we don't understand, I'm not allowed to tell you what you should be doing. I can only tell you what I have done. So I want to be harmed by my error more than you. Economics have been giving us bullshit models now for a long time. Why? Because they're never harmed by their mistakes. We are harmed. Okay? Predictors are never harmed by their mistakes. This is why I'm against someone telling me what he predicts. I want him to tell me, what do you have in your portfolio? What do you do? All right? That's all I want to do. So thank you very much. I put my watch back.
Now, this last clip I'm going to play is from Ben Bernanke walking down the street. Looks like it's perhaps in Washington, D.C. And somebody asks him about the author of The Black Swan. Now, you would think, after we've just listened to all of these pragmatic voices, they really lay the case for why Ben Bernanke's desire to control the system and move the markets through Federal Reserve policy. All these smart voices that I've played over the course of this podcast, they lay the foundation for why you have to know there's always going to be another black swan to arrive. Something is going to come along that you have to be prepared for. You have to be, or you're going to go broke. No one wants to go broke. So Bernanke's walking down the street. Go find the YouTube video clip as well too. It's nice to, because it's hard to hear what he says, but if you see the YouTube clip, you can kind of you see how dismissive he is. But he's basically asked about the author of The Black Swan, and Bernanke, as you're about to hear, says he doesn't pay attention. He doesn't read it. Let me let the clip play.
Nassim Nicholas, I know you made a lot of harsh comments. What is your general position towards Nassim Taleb, the guy who wrote Black Swan?
Oh, I don't read it.
You don't read that? Not at all. No.
So like I said, go watch that on YouTube. The context of seeing the video it's much nicer. It's much nicer. But isn't that good to know? The chairman of the Federal Reserve, the man that apparently knows everything, the man that is in control of putting the intravenous drip of the matrix into your system. Isn't it good to know that he just doesn't care, doesn't read it, doesn't worry about a subject like black swans? It's not surprising though, really, is it? Of course not. Once again, all of these great voices that I've played, and of course, I'm critical of Buffett in my book, but I thought what he said about long-term capital management was spot on. I'm critical of Buffett not because of his tremendous success, but just frankly because, Mr. USA, Warren Buffett, noble do-gooder, and all this other kind of stuff, buy and hold, never sell a stock, is a little disingenuous on how he really has made his money. That's my bone to pick. Anyways, he makes a great point in that first clip I play in this podcast. So, going out, though, a really fun song that I have to play, because I've been on the road now for coming up on 60 days, and I thought this old trucker song, I'm going to play it all the way through, I thought this old trucker song just kind of fit the bill for me. 6 days on the road. Actually, I guess it's going to be 60, as I just said. 60 days on the road. No wind in sight.
Well, I pulled out of Pittsburgh, rolling down that eastern seaboard. I got my diesel wound up and she's running like I never before. Now the speed's on a hill all right. I don't see a cop in sight. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it overnight. I got my 10 forward gears and a Georgia overdrive. I'm taking little white pills and my eyes are open wide. I just passed a Jimmy in a white. I've been a passing everything in sight. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it overnight. Well, it seemed like a month since I kissed my baby goodbye. I could have a lot of women, but I'm not like some other guys. I could find one to hold me tight, but I can never make believe it's alright. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it overnight. ICC is a checking on down the line. I'm a little overweight, my logbook's way behind. But nothing bothers me tonight. I can dodge all the scales alright. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it overnight. Well, my rig's a little old, but that don't mean she's slow. There's a flame from my stack and that smoke's blowing black as coal. My hometown's coming in sight. If you think I'm happy, you're right. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it overnight. 6 days on the road and I'm gonna make it overnight.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.